Hello and welcome to another episode of Comps List Radio, H Poll's signature podcast. We are it's summertime, which means in Arizona, where I am, this is Robert Ferguson. It's summertime, which means that it's about reaching the point where you can't go outside here in Arizona. How are things in Conway, Arkansas, Marie?
Not quite to the point where we can't go outside. It's still late spring for us. 70s, rainy on and off, late or higher 80s, but nothing too bad so far. So things are good. School's out, ready for the summer.
Yeah, very cool. No more teachers, no more books.
Exactly.
Very cool. And your kids are they're done now. And what are their other than baseball? What are their big plans for the summer?
Baseball, video games, I'm sure, will play a big role. Lots of swimming in the summer in Arkansas, so that'll be nice. But mostly probably, how do the kids say it today? Bed rotting,
Oh, is
laying
that
in
what they
bed
say?
during the day. Yeah, that's the term I keep hearing. So I guess that's their plan.
Oh, all right. I like that. I haven't heard that one
Yeah,
yet. This is how I keep, Marie, with your teenage sons, this is how I'm going to have to keep up with the slang so that when students enter in as
exactly.
freshmen at ASU, I'm going to have some sense of what they're talking about.
Exactly. They use it. They sound a lot more like my kids now than they do me. So it helps me a lot.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't know when it was, but my Simpsons references started getting blank stares back from students. I don't know,
Yeah,
about 7 or 8 years ago.
I know. It's so disappointing. No culture.
None, none. Um, and I said the Simpsons thing just so I could set up this next comment. Today we're going to be we're going to be examining in the first of our series of our America 250 series. We are going to be looking at the early 20th century work by Charles Austin Beard, an economic interpretation of the Constitution. I say that because every time I say Charles Austin Beard, my brain wants to go Charles Montgomery Burns.
There, you connected it back.
Right.
There you
Uh, but yeah, the really the incredible work of Charles Austin Beard is sort of this foundational piece in 20th century American historiography. Marie, had you read this book before?
definitely interacted with the argument of this book. I don't know that you could learn about the Revolutionary Era, about the Constitution, the early Republic, without engaging with it in some sense. But I had never read the book completely through until this.
Yeah, me neither. I'd read parts of it, but I'd never read the entire thing. And again, I think we're all kind of aware. If you're a historian, you're kind of aware of sort of the general thrust of this book. It still sort of casts a long shadow, but it sometimes feels like like it casts a long shadow only so that it can be dismissed. Is that your sense?
I think so. I mean, different aspects I think are often dismissed too. It's not just the economic theory part of this that, of course, we'll talk about, but the way that Beard does, or I guess does not handle different subjects, like African Americans or landless whites in the book. So, yeah, I think the pushback is what we know more than anything else. Now, more established scholars had probably learned about Beard in a different sense, but definitely when I was in graduate school, it was who's pushback against this, and a focus on Balin and Wood, which of course we'll talk about, and I'm sure we'll do a whole episode on. But those were my two. That's the foundation of my knowledge in Revolutionary America, Balin and Wood's interpretations, which
Yeah,
build off and push back against Beard.
right. I think that's mine as well. Is that sort of the earliest book on the revolution I read was Ideological Origins
Yes.
by Balin, which I know we're going to be talking about in coming weeks. and that it was an attempt to basically fully dislodge Beard
Right.
and fully dislodge this book as being the way of understanding the constitutional period. I mean, it really is remarkable that this book sort of establishes the foundation for the understanding of the Constitution that really runs through until the end of the Second World War.
Right. And it starts this question, this line of questioning that who benefited from the Constitution? Who benefited from the Revolution? And so even just asking this question was important. And I think that's
Right.
one of the legacies of this work is that he started this line of questioning that other scholars, agree or disagree with him, are going to have to grapple with here. Because it wasn't, it didn't benefit everyone equally. And if you don't like Beard's argument, you can't argue with that.
Yeah. I mean, so this book was criticized for not, has been criticized for who it didn't include. But let me ask you this, Marie. Could you argue that like the Nicole Hannah Jones interpretation of the Revolution is basically just an updating of Beard?
I think you could make that argument. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that in that way, but I think you could make that argument. It's just that with that, you're going to have different voices in there.
Sure.
So, so yeah, I think you could make that argument because it did benefit certain people economically.
Yeah, and again, whether you agree with the Nicole Hannah Jones interpretation is sort of irrelevant to my point, but I mean, I think that
Right.
this notion of the Constitution being a battle between the forces of capitalism, either competing forces of capitalism, or in Beard's broader work, kind of this relationship between capitalism and democracy. Um, I think in those terms, I suspect those who were involved in the 1619 project or around the 1619 project would probably agree.
I think so. I think I found some of this when I was looking into the historiography, like some of the background here, prepping for our episode today, that the 1619 project does build on this in a way. It doesn't just push back against Beard, it
Right.
does add layers to Beard. And
Yeah.
so I think that they would, even if maybe not necessarily credit Beard directly, yeah, I think we can make that argument.
Yeah, I mean, because I think you can see connections between Beard and like Eric Williams, who is not writing in the
Hmm.
American context, but there's major overlap there. And while Beard himself is not a Marxist, there's there's a lot of connective tissue there.
Right, right.
Um, and so it's and anyway, and one thing that Beard does do in Rise of American Civilization, which he writes with his wife, women's suffrage is a major part, and the voices of women are a major part of that book,
Right. So
which
it's not
was
that he
unique
leaves
for the
them out
period.
completely.
Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly.
and I think as we're going to get into this, economic interpretation looks like a 300-page book, but it's not a 300-page book. Like it's really like a 120-page book.
Yeah, it
It's
wasn't too
short.
bad at all. It was accessible. Yep.
It's short
Yep.
because so much of what takes up the meat of this book is figures
Right.
and like analyses of like individuals account like bond portfolios.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And so because of that, like you can, I think, Beard might be able to get a bit of a pass on like, first of all, it's the early 20th century that he's writing. He's going to be, the idea that he's going to take a critical approach is, I think, probably unlikely. But I mean, even then, it's a pretty short book. It's almost like an essay with figures.
Yes. That's definitely how it reads. And especially if you know anything about the Constitution going in. If you have a framework, just a basic knowledge in the Constitution, and you go into this text, you're going to see his argument right away, and you're going to see the evidence he presents for that argument right away. And you're going to see those bond portfolios and the graphs that he has in there. So
Yeah,
that's a big part of it. And it's interesting.
it is.
All of that is very interesting.
Yeah.
But yes, it's not a hard text.
No, no. And I mean, I also don't know if this is the first book anybody should read on the Constitution.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on how far you want to go back in the historiography.
Yeah.
But I think if you're just in a constitution class or, you're just focused on the early republic or the revolution, even this is not the place to
No,
start necessarily.
no, it's not, and I wouldn't discourage people to read from it. And I also think it'd be a great place if you're curious, if what you're researching about is something where you want to have some notion about what these people were invested in. You want to have some notion about the individuals involved at the Constitution. This is as good a resource as any for like,
Yeah, it's excellent.
you know, basically if you want a Wikipedia article on like who was at the Constitution and what their like actual like and what their economic interest there may have been. This like I can't remember what chapter it is, chapter 4, chapter 5 is that.
Right, right. And he's obviously done an extensive amount of research. The only person I think you could even make a slight argument for having done more on these specific people is Forrest McDonald, who is the one who ultimately took down this argument.
Yeah, and I think,
And
yeah,
so,
agreed.
in We the People, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, that and he's explicitly doing that. And he does it in a more in a narrower way, and again we're going to talk about this in a narrower way than Balin and Wood do.
right, right. He is going after Beard's argument, McDonald is, in his
Yeah,
work. I mean, it is
yeah,
very clear. He followed his footsteps and dug a little further. But he's working in the 50s and not in the early 1900s.
right.
So
And
you've got some different sources there.
and one of the things I appreciated about this is that Beard in lots of places goes, listen, this is where the evidence ends.
Yes,
He's like,
yes.
there's more. I don't have time or the inclination to look any further than this. Because
Yes, and he is open about that.
he makes some point in his introduction. He's like, clearly I could have gone further in this research, but like I have a life.
Yes,
It's like I have
that
other
is essentially
obligations.
what he says here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've got a life, and like this was what I could get, and like
right,
if you find more that fully discredits me, I accept it.
right, right. And he wasn't still alive when MacDonald published We the People,
Right.
but I think he would have had a lot to say about that and then would have probably encouraged that work.
Yeah, he would have, I think. But I really just like I had to chuckle when I was reading the introduction because he clearly was like, "Listen, this is at best a starting point."
Right, right. This is enough. I've proved my point. You can decide what to do with it from here.
Right. And so, like in that way, that's sort of how I see, where with the 1619 project, you can sort of say, "Hey, listen, we really are building on Beard, and we're following the path that Beard actually laid out. That, like, this is the beginning." Um, and he,
At
and
least
again,
of those questions.
yeah, right. And again, what you want to think of it is a different question. That we can evaluate the evidence, um, separately. But I mean, I think just like interpretively that. Okay,
That framework
so
is there.
um, Marie, you're the biographer among us. You want to tell us a little bit about
Let me
Charles Montgomery Burns? I mean Charles Austin Beard.
Yes, yes. Let me. So before I get started in this, one of the things I was thinking about when I was looking at Beard and thinking about this book is this is the start of our 250 series. And so I'm thinking about, why are we starting with this book and what can we tell our audience about how this fits into that? And the biggest part, and I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this as well, but to me, it's this debate that these questions, these big questions that Beard asked. So we're thinking this year as Americans, um, what does the country mean? What does the founding of the country mean to us? Who did this benefit? Who did this leave out? And Beard's asking those questions for the first time in the historiography. Who was the country created for? Because it wasn't created for, we the people at that point. It just, I mean, we have the evidence, we can look at it. As Beard and others point out, that wasn't the purpose of the Constitution. And so having these debates, like I kept seeing this question come back and back, this line of questioning come back. And that's how I connected it to the 250 series was, okay, we're having this larger debate. Even though the economic interpretation may have not led us to start with this overall debate about the questions of the Revolution and the Constitution, that is a starting point. And I think a pretty good starting point for our series.
Yeah, I think it is. I also think it's the origins of the modern historiography of the period. Bancroft has his books, and there's a whole series of books that are written in the 19th century. But, to some degree, Beard is Thucydides, and everything before is Herodotus and Homer.
Yeah, I like
And,
that.
yeah,
Like that.
like Thucydides is trying to keep it in the worldly, the here and the now, and there's scientific analysis going on. Beard has footnotes, Thucydides does not, but such is life. Um, whereas beforehand, like Bancroft at points would say, well, it's just divine providence that this worked out for America, sounding an awful lot like Herodotus crediting the gods. Thucydides sort of dismissing that and saying, no, it's about personal interest, it's about the here and the now, and that's really the focus. So I guess that's where I see this in the period is this is the beginning. And and the reason it is the beginning is because Beard is asking these questions that you were just alluding to. He's really the first major figure to ask these questions. It's like the Constitution was not just an exercise in political science. There's other aspects of this, and what were their goals? And we're going to talk about another guy in a few weeks, Douglas Adair. Douglas Adair writes a great essay called "Fame and the Founding Fathers," where he's sort of building on Beard and saying, well, it wasn't just financial interest that they were interested in; it was posterity. They wanted to be famous forever, right? And that's another personal interest that's motivating them here,
exactly.
right? And so Beard is looking at the pecuniary, while others will look at other things. But it's this notion that these were not just benevolent political scientists with their hand sort of moved by the divine.
Right.
But
it was real life.
Right.
This had real implications. These men were coming together. And as, Beard talked about, this was essentially overthrowing the Articles of Confederation. For all purposes, this was a coup. This was not an intellectual experiment.
Right.
And
right.
So yeah.
That's a really, I love that. He's like, no, he's like the constitutional coup.
Yes. I like that he just laid it out. Because, when you think about it the way that he lays it out, okay, yeah, that was a coup. I buy it, and that's what happened. And he does lay it out well.
Yeah, and he's just like, they're not following the same amending formula.
Right.
Right? They're basically, in some states, they're essentially rigging it.
Right.
We had this notion where in New York, right, because of the Federalist Papers, there was this grand debate of ideas between like the anti-Federalist forces led by Clinton and the Federalist forces, led by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. But Beard's like, no, it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
He's like, you can look at it that way, but when I look through this evidence, this is not what I'm seeing.
Right. I can't remember what state it was. I'd have to look back into it when he goes through the ratification process. And he's like, things were so fast there, the anti-Federalist forces just couldn't get organized. They did it so fast.
Right. They're going to get this passed.
Yeah.
Essentially, is what they're looking at.
Anyway, I interrupted your biography.
Oh, no, I did. I got us off track there. but I can get back to this. Charles Austin Beard, born in 1874 near Knightstown, Indiana. And he came from a pretty prosperous family, but he is going to see working class life firsthand. So he's kind of seen the Gilded Age unfold, and he's going to come of age, especially as a scholar in the Progressive era. Of course, he's part of the Progressive School, which we've talked about before, this economic conflict, which you see throughout his work. Eventually, he meets his wife, Mary Beard, who I would say someday we should do an episode on Mary Beard. Very impressive. The more I found out about her, the more impressed I was. But he met her in his undergraduate at I think it's called DuPuis University, but anyway, going through his undergraduate degree, he goes to Oxford. While in Oxford, he and Mary mostly get involved in the feminist movement there and the suffrage movement there. He's also going to start working for the working class and establishing what becomes a Ruskin College there at Oxford for more working class individuals that wouldn't have had access to Oxford before. So you see early on, like the point of going back that far is that you see early on this activism in his work, and definitely in his wife's, what becomes her work, but in her life as well. She's going to work with Alice Paul back in the United States in the suffrage movement, and he supports that. When World War I breaks out, he's at Columbia. He supports the war itself, but two of his colleagues are fired because they spoke out against the war, and he resigns in protest of that. So he doesn't resign in protest of the war itself, but in how his colleagues were treated at Columbia. So again, you see this through line here where he sees disadvantages among the working class and wants to do something about that. He sees this unfairness to his colleagues and he wants to push back against that. And you see this throughout his career, and you see that tension in his writing as well, especially in the book that we're looking at. He wrote at least one book with his wife. She did not have a graduate degree, a PhD, and so, of course, during that period, she is often discredited. Her work's not taken seriously, but it is known that she worked very closely with him, especially in his later work. He died in 1948, so before his work was kind of discredited, or at the very least, before historians decided, okay, we've got evidence that this is not the complete picture here. So he never saw that come to fruition in the late 1950s. But prolific writer, sold over 11 million copies of his different works. He had dozens of published articles and books. And then, of course, this book is in 1913, so one of his earlier works.
Yeah. I mean, and this is the book that I think really makes him famous.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a yeah. Okay. So we're going to get back into his biography, I think, as we get, because I really hope to do an episode one day on the rise of American civilization with him, discussing him and Mary,
Right.
which would be great.
Yeah.
But because in a lot of ways that's a more sophisticated book, I think, than this one is. But that wasn't part of our homework assignment, so we're not going to talk about that today. But Marie, how would you, we've talked a little about, and I think most of our listeners will understand that economic interest was at the center of the Constitution, according to Beard, and class conflict was at the center of this. How would you more broadly, or even more narrowly, describe the argument at the center of this book?
I mean, like you said, you laid it out well. He is arguing here that the founders, the 55 men who went to the Constitutional Convention, had differing economic interests, and they're going to create a document and a government that benefits their various economic interests, whether that be in personal property or in real property, like in land and enslaved people, which is how he kind of looks at the Southern delegates for sure. But you have this tension throughout, and these debates, he's arguing, all are within the Constitutional Convention. The debates that we're seeing are all kind of within this focus of these men's economic interests. It is not, he is arguing, it is not ideological. It is not some grand moral strategy. It is these men were being hurt by the Articles of Confederation economically. Their property wasn't being protected. They felt like they were having to respond or having some limits placed on their power by landless men in some cases, or definitely the middling class. And they wanted power and they wanted their economic interests protected. And the book just lays that out through, like you said, lots of evidence, lots of statistical data, but through his argument as well.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, like he distinguishes, virtually everybody who comes to the convention is harmed by the Articles of Confederation. But there's one class of people that's more harmed than the other class, according to Beard. And the class that's the most harmed are the ones who hold public securities.
Right.
So that typically government bonds, that's what we're talking about. And that those people are witnessing a collapse in the value of their bonds under the Articles of Confederation. And these people are typically the wealthiest of the Americans. They tend to be concentrated in the few major financial centers that there are. They also tend to be less even though they're invested in land, they tend to be less less connected to land.
Less
right?
tied to that economically.
Right. And so he thinks these guys are the main, and Alexander Hamilton, although according to Beard, and I didn't really understand this, to be honest, he wasn't that rich a guy. Hamilton, at least according to Beard, didn't have that many assets. He commanded he ended up commanding a considerable salary as a lawyer, but he was never a particularly wealthy guy, at least according to Beard. And but he sort of personifies this emerging capitalist class who has a lot of money and movable wealth. And they are, at least according to Beard, the major engine for the final form that the Constitution takes. Whereas the opposing force at the convention are those who mostly are interested in land. No, there's a third and fourth group to Beard too. There's ones that are primarily interested in Western land speculation, and those who also are invested in nascent industries and want the tariff. Right. So those are sort of the four major economic kind of groupings. But and Beard says there's overlap among all of them. There's very few people who are singly one or singly another. They're sort of all like, a lot of people who have interest in land, some of that land is in Kentucky, or some of that land is across the Appalachians. And so but there's a lot of people who are only, who have a lot of movable wealth, and then like some of that, what he calls personalty, which is a great term, the public securities, and they own a lot of Western land. That is only going to be like, right, they're speculating in the West. And there's a few people that are really only speculating in the West. But there's not that, and then of course, and then as I said, there's that class that's sort of got that investing in that nascent industry and wants the protective tariff. And so those are sort of the major, and the people who own the bonds want a strong government that has a reliable tax base and a strong government that can, and although this isn't clear in the convention, Beard makes it very clear, like in the first session of Congress, they want a bank. Right?
Right.
And so it's clear to them, at least according to Beard, that um, throughout the Constitutional Convention, even though there might not have been much debate over it, it was understood by many people that one of the purposes of the convention of the Constitution was to create a bank.
Right. Right. And that was a big problem under the Articles of Confederation, is you had exchange rates between the different states at that
Right.
point. And if you are trying to consolidate those securities or consolidate that wealth, or in Hamilton's case, I think it was about power more than anything else. Like he saw that as those men as his power base, even if he wasn't distinctly part of that class. He definitely saw his power center being there. And so if you don't have a national bank or a national financial system, you do not have that power. And so that is you're absolutely right about the bank. That's a great point, because that is a big part of the reason they're there, even if they're not going to put it in the body of the Constitution, because they know that Southerners are going to push back against that.
Well, the landed class, anyway, whether it's the Southerners or not, the landed class isn't thrilled with it. Isn't going to be thrilled with it, according to Beard, because there are Southerners who are, the Charleston elite, Tidewater elite, that kind of thing. Savannah, maybe to a lesser extent, but and he ends up anyway. So, in order to prove his point, for those of you who never read the book, what he does is he tries to assign each delegate to the convention, like, where they stand, like which of these groups are they in. And so this is how he ends up, like, beginning with Abraham Baldwin, who was a representative of Georgia. He, like, says, here are the bonds that he owned. Here's the Western land he was invested in. What did he own land at home? Like, where were his economic interests? And it really is fascinating, and and so arcane almost for a historian.
Right.
Because we don't do granular detail at that level typically.
Right.
At least for more than one or two people.
Right.
And he does it for everybody who goes.
Yeah. All 55.
Yeah. And his longest one, for those of you who are interested, is on Hamilton. It's about 3 pages.
Right.
And
Hamilton and Madison.
Yeah, Madison doesn't.
His go-to.
Yes. Yeah, Madison doesn't quite get the same sketch because Madison doesn't own public securities. And so Madison's interests, and Beard is clear on this, Madison's economic interests are harder to discern.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the places his argument is almost undermined in his own work, because Madison was very ideological. Mm-hmm. And he just writes about this, and Beard has Madison as one of the central figures in this, and he talks about his ideas here while saying at the same time, or outlining, maybe not explicitly, but outlining here, that Madison is harder to fit into those boxes.
Right. Madison, in fact, becomes his like point of describing others, because he views Madison as almost this impartial observer.
Right.
Now, I understand Madison is not impartial, and he does get to the economic interests that Madison has towards the end, but it's not as clear-cut as the others. And Madison is pretty, like, in his own sketches of people, he uses Madison's own sketches of people often. Right.
Well, and he had the most evidence from Madison, too, in his defense.
We all
who wrote more about these things. Yes,
we all do.
Exactly. He was writing for posterity.
Right. Like, what's the book? And I'm embarrassed I can't think of the name of the author. It just came out a couple of years ago, but like by Madison's hand, or something. That our whole understanding of the Constitution is because Madison had the best notes.
Right.
So we don't even realize it. But like, all of our understanding of the Constitution is through Madison, because he wrote the most and was the he was there.
We have it.
He was there the whole time. He was the only one there the whole time.
Right.
And
yes, we're very lucky to have those notes.
But so, like, kind of like Beard, as historians, we're all sort of left with this weird Madison character.
Right.
Like, who's the central figure, and he's also the voice by which we understand it.
Right.
And anyway, I think that's but yeah, but those are kind of the broad categories that I mentioned, or that we mentioned, that Beard lays out. And again, for the public security holders, he really comes down to that these are the most aggressive. This is the origins of what might become of what becomes the Federalist Party to Beard. I mean, obviously, there's the Federalist grouping in 1787 is larger, but what becomes the core of the Federalist Party moving forward are these public security holders and the interests of bondholders. And they're interested in a strong central government that can basically that can coerce people into paying taxes in order to service bonds. That because they know the moment that happens, the price of bonds goes up.
Right.
That they can sell. And the other thing that they want to stop the state governments from the paper emissions, from the paper
Yes.
money emissions, right? These
Yes.
are a lot of times these bondholders are also creditors. And they know that inflation is an assault on their ability to on their perspectives.
Right.
So that's, and he points to the Constitution. He lays out in various places. He's like, in the document, this clause right here, and he'll lay it out. I don't have it at hand here, but he'll say, like, this clause right here is very, like, if you read it, as soon as you realize, if you look at this for a second from the perspective of a bondholder, you're like, oh yeah, that's to protect me. He says, when we go clause by clause through the Constitution, and if you just for a second put the glasses on of a bondholder, of a Gouverneur Morris, right, or a James Wilson, all of a sudden, or a George Washington, all of a sudden you start to see why this document is written, at least according to Beard,
Right.
in the way that it is.
And exactly. And if you're at a state constitutional convention where you're going to ratify this document, you would read it that way as well, because
Right.
those conventions are self-selecting who can vote. Property owning white men can vote for the most part.
Right.
And so they're going to have those economic interests, and they're going to read that, and they're going to know at the time who that protects. So
Right.
even if you don't have to say it explicitly, they're going to understand that language.
Right. And you've got these state legislatures, according to Beard, under the Articles of Confederation, that are trying to outdo themselves in ways to undermine the most property classes and the creditor classes, because they typically represent the perspectives of, or there's a greater influence among lower, people lower on the socioeconomic ladder
Right.
in those state
Right.
legislatures. So, to Beard and at least the perspective of these proto-federalists and these major bondholders, you need this new national government where their influence is going to carry the day. I mean, he at one point, over the state legislatures, and he makes a really interesting point on Georgia, where he says there's something like there might be 5 public bondholders in the whole state of Georgia. Like, so, okay, so if there's 5 of them in the whole state of Georgia, Georgia's not a big state at the time, but 5 of them is not very many. What influence could 5 people hope to wield in Milledgeville, which was the state capital, I think, at the time? It might have been Augusta, but I think it was Milledgeville. It might have been at the time. But if they were united with their class in Philadelphia, in New York,
Exactly.
in Charleston, all of a sudden they're a political force to be reckoned with.
Exactly. They don't have to answer to those interests that we are seeing under the Articles of Confederation, those voices that are becoming louder. Right. They don't have to answer to them. They are in league now with those economic interests in Philadelphia or in other cities across the country. So 5 people can have extraordinary influence in that case.
Right. And so the reason that, although they're typically, also elite class, the landed class, who don't necessarily have an interest in bonds, one of the reasons why they would be opposed to such a constitution, or one of the reasons why they don't really care if the bonds are serviced or not, is because they know that they're the ones that are going to have to pay the taxes to service the bonds, service the interest on the bonds. And Beard lays out why really the only type of tax that the federal government is able to, and that's at the state level, state legislature level. So this is why the landed class, even the elite landed class in the states, according to Beard, are willing to tolerate some of the perspectives of the poor farmers, because they're they're like that populist force that can be used against the bondholding class.
Right. Right.
So then, at least in Beard's telling, that bondholding class has to find a way to encourage the landed class to sign on to the Constitution. And one of the ways they do it is they know a lot of them are invested in Western lands, and so you need a strong federal government that can go and enforce American sovereignty over the Ohio Valley.
Yep. Appease those speculators, like right. Washington.
Like Washington. I mean, did you know this? Beard says that Washington might have been the richest guy in the country at the time. Did you know that?
I'd heard that before. He lays it out well, and I buy into it, but I had heard that before. It had to have come from Beard.
Yeah. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah. It's wild.
Yeah, if you go through Washington's entire like his assets, and you're like, whoa, yeah, and like you're like, oh, did he own these things? And he's like, yeah, I checked his estate.
Right.
Like, oh, okay, right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And
right. Washington wants to portray himself as a farmer and a general, and in reality, he's an investor.
Yeah.
And heavily invested.
And what's so funny is there's this, I think, this simplistic notion, one that I legitimately bought into. I'm not an early, I'm not a historian of the early republic, so I don't, sometimes you just take things at face value and don't investigate them any further. But Washington didn't take a salary because he was a gentleman when he was president or when he was commander of the Continental Army. And so there's sort of this notion, well, he was really he was kind of struggling, right? And so that explains his obsession with looking after his plantation, right? He didn't look like he was struggling, according to Beard.
Not according to Beard, not at all.
But a lot of his money was wrapped up in Western lands and public securities. And I mean,
right.
And a lot of these guys were paid, and you can understand it. This is one of the things that's interesting that I never really thought of until I was reading this book, is you get this great tension among Revolutionary War veterans, right? A lot of whom are paid with bonds, which are depreciating rapidly.
Yes.
And a lot of the rank and file vets were also paid with land allotments. But those land allotments needed a federal government in order to be able to enforce, because a lot of those land allotments were either in contested territory between the United States and competing and local tribes, or were just definitely in tribal country.
Right. And you need that federal government to protect that land, whether you're a speculator or a veteran, or which, of course, the veterans have trouble later with property taxes, but you've got the federal government by that.
Right.
So and the Constitution's done.
And if you want a protective tariff, if you're somebody who's invested, there's this understanding that in order to get the landed guys really on board here, they're not going to want to pay big taxes to the federal government, at least land taxes or wealth taxes. But you need to get that interest serviced somehow. So how are you going to do that? With an impost, right? And so even though it's presented as only this revenue tool, Beard says, yeah, everybody understood that it was a protective tool. even before Hamilton kind of sets up his system, there was this understanding in 1787 that, the only revenue we're gonna be able to get is through the impost. We don't want to jump on state government sovereignty anywhere. And so you can imagine somebody with a small mill in Pennsylvania or the Connecticut Valley like salivating over that notion. And then to bring it back to the South, Beard, I think he asked a great question, which is, so how do you get landed Southern interests who knows that they're going to be the ones who really have to pay the tariff? Maybe they're invested in Western lands, maybe they're not. But they're trying to export their tobacco, typically, or rice at the time.
Right.
They're trying to export their tobacco or rice. And they know that a protective tariff is going to harm those interests, that ability to do so. So how do you get them to sign up? If they're public security holders, that's how you do it. But if they're not, now you've got a big federal government that can protect them from slave insurrection.
Yep, that power. They're giving them more power.
Saying you're losing here, but we'll protect you here.
Yep, the Fugitive Slave Clause, the 3/5 Compromise.
Right, and then the 3/5 right, and then the 3/5 Compromise ensures that their perspective is never going to get lost, right, in a federal Congress that is going to, when the population bases are in the North,
right,
to the Northeast.
You've given up these. I mean, again, like we talked about the bondholders reading between the lines of the document at these state constitutional conventions. Southern landowners would have done the same thing. They would know exactly why that was in there.
Right.
I mean, it was a compromise, or they called it, of course, a compromise made at the time to get those landowners on board.
But from the Southern slave owners' perspective, it's a Faustian bargain.
Right.
Right. From the northeastern bondholders' perspective, with the exception of Governor Morris and a few, listen, there's abolitionists at the convention. We know there's abolitionists at the convention, right?
Right.
And they hated the fact that they were going to be protecting slavery in the Constitution. And so they had to compromise with the notion of slavery in order to get the Constitution passed. Right. And then meanwhile, Southern slaveholders have to their Faustian bargain is we're not going to be the ones paying the bulk of the tax. But we're going to get this. We're going to get protection we're going to get a protection from slave insurrection.
Right.
And so it is.
And the ability to. Oh, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Just putting in there, neither side is completely happy with what they're getting out of this, but you have the ability to amend the document.
Mm-hmm.
And that's done on purpose.
Yeah.
One, of course, they can't know everything, and I think they realize that. But two, their interests are going to change, and they realize that as well.
Right.
And their power lies in, Beard is arguing, their power lies in these economic interests, and if those change, you need to be able to update this document to reflect those changes.
Right. So I think that kind of, lays it out that they had some interests in common. They had some economic interests that competed with each other, and that before we're going to do an episode in a few weeks, I hope, that with our colleagues at HPOL on the Federalist Papers. But it was really interesting. Beard says it's an economic treatise. And I'd, of course, never read it as an economic treatise. I'd always read it as a political science document, as a document of political philosophy. I wonder, as we reread the Federalist Papers for our episode in a few weeks, because you and I just read this book, how jaundiced, will we look at this with those papers with a more jaundiced eye than we would have otherwise?
I know, it really did. This was one of the things I was going to bring up at the end, but how he places Federalist 10 at the center of all of this.
Hmm.
Now, of course, that's how I learned the Federalist Papers. Federalist 10 is the most important Federalist paper. You read it, you discuss it in seminar, like it's there. I didn't realize it wasn't always that way.
Right.
That it is Beard that makes that the central part of this argument. And so I do think, I mean, I will read them differently after reading Beard for sure.
Yeah. I mean, when I read Beard's introduction, and he's kind of laying out. So in his introduction, he's basically laying out his economic theory of history, and he is, he's building on a guy named Edwin Seligman, who wrote in 1903, I think, who has this sort of non-Marxist materialist conception of history. And but one of the things that he uses, one of the quotes that he uses to justify his materialist conception of history is from Madison and Federalist 10. And I was a little upset because my dissertation is pretty materialist, and I justify it with that exact same quote from Federalist 10. And I was like, darn it, people are going to think I lifted this from Beard. Like, he literally begins at the same spot and ends at the same spot.
Oh my. Well, that's great.
Yeah.
If anybody knows Beard by the,
probably okay in 2026, but
you're probably okay.
so I got to change it. I got to find
I
something else
love
now.
that.
As I turned it into the book, I'm like, I can't use that anymore.
Yeah.
But anyway, he lays out, and the quote from Federalist 10 is basically the notion that like the Constitution is a way to channel these various interests in the country, and all of the interests that he lays out are economic interests, right? And primarily in property versus non-property classes, but also these various other, a few of the like merchants versus farmers, bankers versus any various other factions. And he says, you can map on the factions based on what their economic interest is. And so Beard kind of builds his, he uses that to justify his theory of the convention. And anyway, I got a kick out of that. I was a little upset, but I got a kick out of it.
Well, at least you know now.
I know now, right? Now I can change it.
Right.
Now I can change it. But anyway, it probably is. I just wanted to note that like he does lay out the economic theory of history at the beginning. He acknowledges he's doing something kind of novel.
Yep.
And he tries to justify it.
Yeah.
So we've walked through this, and we're almost at an hour. Marie, what aspects was any of this convincing to you, oh child of Balin? And,
Right. I mean, I definitely think there were economic interests at play. I think it's just more nuanced. I think Beard's making this, like you said, a kind of novel, and he realizes that argument about this based on a lot of research that was available during the time. I mean, of course, we have news sources, and McDonald's going to push back against this. And I think We the People, McDonald's book has a lot. I mean, it has just a lot more information, especially at those state level conventions and about their economic interests. But I do think there were economic interests. I liked that Beard didn't make the founders out to be villains. These are complicated men who are serving, yes, they're serving their own interests in some cases, but they do seem to have a legitimate belief that this is going to be better for the future of the country. Not necessarily a moral belief, but just the future of the economic system in the country, and can the country remain as one versus as 13 little states, little countries, the way it was under the Articles of Confederation. So I do buy and I definitely buy the line of questioning he creates. I think that is probably the part of the book that kind of came at me the most, was the idea of who did it benefit. We have to ask that question.
mm-hmm.
And I think it was good that Beard started that. And I can't imagine, I mean, we ask that question in all histories that we write now. Who did this benefit? Who was left out of this? Especially in political history, because economic power is political power. This power they're creating for themselves is political power. And so, yeah, there are pieces of it, but I just think overall it's just too complicated. Like, this is so much more complicated than he makes it. I did find it really interesting, and I think we can take this at face value, all of the research he does. It is interesting knowing what, like, George Washington's portfolio. That is legitimately interesting. And so I think that part of it as well is very useful. But it's like a springboard more than anything else to further historical study.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, this is what unfortunately always happens in history is that, we remember Charles Beard as being this extreme economic determinist because that's kind of the argument he lays out here, but he's very careful to put caveats everywhere.
I think, yeah, yes,
Like, he's like, listen, you know, this could, this is my, this is me trying to put this in my box, but recognizing that there could be other factors at play here. And I think
right.
what he does well is that it's like, okay, before we get really wrapped up in somebody's ideology, can we at least like check out what their personal interest might have been first? You know, did they have a did they benefit? Did they want And just because they might benefit materially from it doesn't mean they're insincere,
Right. And he's
right?
careful to say
And Beard's
that.
careful about that, right?
Yeah,
You know, it doesn't mean they're insincere, but maybe we can, and because heck, maybe somebody invests in something because they're truly sincere.
right,
You know,
right.
you invest in American bonds and like the sixes or tens. I can never remember the denomination. Not because you want profit necessarily, but because you really firmly believe in this project and you want to use your wealth in order to assist this project. And you believe that by creating a stronger national government, you're going to be assisting in your broader project. So, and he, but so you can, all of those things can be true at the same time, right? But I think Beard forces you to reckon with the notion that there are material interests here, and it's useful to investigate it.
Right. And he encourages, I mean, it came across to me that he's encouraging future scholars to dig deeper. He's
Yeah,
saying this is a starting point. We haven't looked at this yet. Let's look at it this way. And then you take it further. That's why I think if he had been able to engage with his detractors, we would have gotten such a rich conversation. I just can't imagine, based on his background and based on his writing, that he would have shut that down completely.
yeah,
I
I
think
don't
he
think
would
so.
have accepted that. And
Especially because when you read Rise of American Civilization, um, he's by no means an extreme. He's no determinist.
right,
I think
right,
that's the difference. He's not really a determinist. He's not a determinist in the way that Marxists are. He's more like this is the primary influence, right? And it can be deterministic, but it is not necessarily always that way. And the only way, and this is why he runs through everybody, is because he's like, we have to see if it's the economic interest that's really motivating them or not. He doesn't just list them and go, these are the people that are public security holders and these ones are the ones that are not. Right? You actually get a blurb on each one of them where he tries to
right.
like guess what his interest is. And like that's really nuanced. It's
Yes,
audacious, frankly.
yeah,
You know, it's a little unwieldy, perhaps, to do that at scale. When you got only 55 people, it's possible. It's still unwieldy, but it's possible. But if you were to do every state convention, you couldn't do it. He admits that you can't do it.
right.
Right. Um, but anyway, I just I came away generally impressed from the book.
Yeah,
And
definitely more impressed than the conversations I've had about it in seminar, because it does
yeah,
shut it down. Because
yeah,
it's always in relation to another text. So I've never spent an entire, like what we're doing here on Beard alone. But looking at his work directly was very beneficial.
yeah. I think so too. Yeah, so I mean, I guess Marie, like if you're listening to this, I don't think you need to read the book unless you're purely interested. I think this podcast probably gives you enough on it for 2026. Is that probably fair?
I agree. I think so. Not just because it's us saying it, but because it's the truth.
Yeah, I think it's the truth.
But yeah, I think this is probably good.
Again, unless you're interested in like if you're really interested in South Carolina's tax base, this is a good book for you. Like again, it runs you through what's South Carolina's tax base, what's Charleston's tax base, what's what's
Right.
Columbia's tax base. And so again, I think this book is great from that perspective.
Yes. Yes. If you're an economist who's interested in history, read it.
There's a data
If
set
you're
here.
a history,
There's a data
exactly.
set
Yeah.
here. And this is a thing, we're running up against the clock here, so I don't want to go too far into this, but like, Beard is also a political scientist. He's not just a historian. And this book definitely reads social sciencey. It's not necessarily true humanities, it's social sciencey. And sometimes it feels like a poli-sci project because again,
Right.
there's data sets, right, that he's
Right.
using.
Right. Right.
But with a historical approach, like we're not just going to categorize these people, we're going to try to actually investigate them. What are their, which I think is this great mixture of poli sci and history.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, he does it
and
well.
yeah, and he, um, anyway, we could probably leave it there. But yeah, anyway, so I guess I'll just sum by saying he does sort of create these two major forces that kind of are the broad forces that begin at the Constitution and are the kind of the main driving forces for American history, according to Beard, which are the one capitalist class that are kind of Hamiltonian, and the other capitalist class that become Jeffersonian. They're the ones more tied to the land, tied to eventually agriculture, and then this other class that's tied to movable wealth
Right.
and personalty.
Yep. He's setting. Yeah.
Right? And so that's how he explains the Federalists versus the Republicans. That's how he explains the emerging Whigs, right? And that's how he eventually explains the Civil War. Not in this book, but in later works.
Right. Right.
And
But he's setting it up here.
he's setting it up here. That it is that American history is this conflict between, or American political history, at least, is this conflict between these two major social classes, crudely called the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. So I should probably actually mention that as I got distracted in other things, because that does set up the rest of his work.
That is,
But
yeah.
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 Anyway, any final thoughts on this?
I'm glad we started our 250 series with this. I think it's really going to put everything else into perspective. I enjoyed it. You know, it may be, like we said, unnecessary for graduate students to look at completely, but knowing Beard and knowing the argument and knowing that it's more nuanced than you're probably going to learn is important.
Yeah,
And so listen
yeah,
to this podcast, know where the text afterwards come from, and you'll be good to go.
right, right. I think that's great. Anyway, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. I think we're doing Balin and maybe Robbins next.
I think so, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I know
Um,
Balin.
yeah, and we'll go from there.
Sounds
All right.
great.
See you next time, Marie.
Bye.
Oh, all right. That was great.